Now that we have the war started and we know what types of weapons are being used and how the fighting is going to change, we want to talk about the war fronts. And anytime we talk about a war front, we're talking about where active conflict is taking place. And you're going to see three main fronts in World War One. And there's a lot of activity going on other places. And you see by this map, other countries have jumped in the war by the time that it kicks off. But the main belligerents or countries fighting we're going to see them in action, and the fighting is going to take place in three major locations. You have what we call the Western Front, which you see in France there by the marked by the red line, where Germany and France are going at it. And then on the Eastern Front, over in Russia, you see another massive red line there as well. You also have the Middle Eastern Front. You see the edge of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, what's modern day Turkey down there in the bottom right of your map. And there's going to be activity going on there as well. Now, there's some other small fronts you see here, like in Italy. There's a little red line there, and the Balkan Peninsula with Greece. But there's really just three main fronts. Now, one other place where there's not a front listed, but World War One gives rise to the term the home front. And what this means is that in World War One, the advanced level of communication, the ability for people to get information has changed rapidly. And so, as countries figure out this war is not going to be a quick war, they have to realize we have to keep the people supporting this conflict. People have to believe it's worthwhile. And so, governments are going to go to great lengths to make sure that their population support this war. So you have the multiple fronts for this war, and sometimes they call them a theater of conflict, somewhere where the activity's happening. And let's talk about what's happening in those on those fronts in the early years of the war. And the first couple years of the war really feel like nothing is happening after the first 6 months. And so let's talk about that. Now, on the Western Front, what you see here is Germany planning its strategy of attack. They had always thought they were going to have to fight a two-front war against France and Russia. And so they said, let's come up with a strategy for that because it's probably going to happen at some point. Ultimately, they decided on something called the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan was made up by a general named Schlieffen, shocker. And Schlieffen's goal was here's what we're going to do. We want to knock out France very quickly. We're going to focus all our resources and invade France, go through Belgium, and wipe it out, capture the city of Paris, then turn all of our resources around and head straight to Russia to deal with them. And there's a couple reasons for this strategy. One was that they always saw France and the French military as the bigger threat. That was the more major concern. All right. Now, also, there's another concern that called for this strategy. They knew that Russia would be slower to mobilize for war, meaning get their artillery pieces ready, get their soldiers equipped, fed, trained, get their planes ready to go, and pilots up in the air. And so they said, listen, if we can wipe out France very quickly within a matter of a month or two, then we can turn all our resources around. And by the time we get to the Eastern Front, we'll be ready for Russia and they won't have a jump start on us. Okay? Now, during the first few months of the war, the Schlieffen Plan looks like it's working. Even though they get some stiff resistance in Belgium, Germany gets through Belgium and they go right through France, close to where you see that Marne River, very near to the city of Paris. And it seems like the war might be over very quickly. But the French are going to mount a considerable resistance and they're going to put all this effort into stopping the Germans. And this is where they start digging in the trenches. From where outside the city of Paris, all the way north to the sea, the German army keeps trying to get around the French army to flank them, and they're never able to do it because they dig in these trenches, and so you get kind of a stalemate after the first few months of the war. So really, in the first couple of years of the war, after Germany gets close to that Marne River, you're going to see the fighting take place a lot in France, and it's going to be the same thing over and over again. One side attacks the opposing trench, and they get repelled. And then the other side tries the same thing, and they get repelled. And what you get are a lot of massive battles with lots of dead bodies. So that's what's going on the Western Front. So the Western Front starts out good for Germany, and then it becomes a stalemate. Now let's go over to the Eastern Front really quickly. Okay, the Eastern Front, Germany's going to have more luck. And Germany's going to have to end up doing a lot of the fighting because Austria-Hungary's military is kind of inept. They're not nearly as tough as what they thought. And what you see right here is a good indicator of how well this is going to go for Germany. Poor Russia is not prepared or not up to the fight. Remember, they got bullied around by the Japanese in 1904, 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War, and the Germans are going to expose all the deficiencies and problems with Russia. They don't have nearly as good of equipment. They're not really interested in the fight as much as Germany. And so ultimately, the Germans are going to push them back. And you see that green line shows you where eventually the Russians are going to get pushed back too. And so it's going to go really ugly for the Russians. In fact, they're going to be humiliated in this particular war. So Germany on the Eastern Front having way more success than they are on the Western Front. Okay, now let's briefly go to the Middle East for a minute too. And the Middle East is very different in a lot of ways. And hang on, I just messed that up by going backwards. Okay, the Middle East, what's really going on there is that the Allies, Great Britain and France, what they really do to help themselves out in the Middle East to make sure that the Ottoman Empire is not a real threat, they go to the Middle East and start recruiting local tribes, local Arab tribes, and other groups. And they tell them that, hey, you help us overthrow the Ottoman Empire, and in return, we'll support you in creating your own nation after the war's over. And so they would recruit people to fight against the Ottoman Empire, a lot of locals, and provide them with some military support also, so that they could try to neutralize any help that the Ottoman Empire might give them. There's one or two major battles there. If you're interested, look up the Battle of Gallipoli, where Great Britain tries to invade the Ottoman Empire. It goes really badly for them. Now, it becomes pretty clear that this is going to be a long, drawn-out war, and a lot of people are looking and saying, what's America's role in this? And America, the American president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, says, we're taking a very strict stance of neutrality. We are not getting involved. It's not our fight, not our problem. And there's a couple reasons for that. Even if America wanted to get in, it wouldn't be clear whose side they would be on. They have a lot of sympathies for both sides, and that's because they're doing a lot of business economically with a lot of the nations involved. And so that obviously puts them in a bad spot. But another problem is they got a lot of cultural ties to both sides. Great Britain in particular and France have a lot of common history going back to the Revolution, and since that time they have rebuilt the relationship that was severed back then. There's also a lot of German and Italian immigrants in the United States. So it's like, whose side would we be on anyway? Now, Woodrow Wilson, though, and the United States are more than happy to sell weapons and supplies to both sides during this war. Woodrow Wilson and the United States, they're all about doing business. Now, the thing is this, even though they're selling weapons and supplies to both sides, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and the Central Powers, they don't really get a lot of the weapons and supplies meant for them because the British had set up a very effective blockade. So really, Great Britain and France and Russia, the Allied powers, are going to be end up being the beneficiaries of this trade of weapons and supplies. And so even though America's neutral, they start leaning towards one particular side, and we'll talk about how Germany's going to try to stop that.